An anomaly is something that deviates from the norm, and the Pokémon world is filled with them. Inconsistencies, unsolved mysteries, out-of-place elements. In this Iceberg, we'll explore many of the most mysterious incongruences in Pokémon Red, Blue and Yellow. Welcome to the Gen 1 Pokémon Anomalies Iceberg.
Say my name. Eisenberg. You're goddamn right.
Thirsty Saffron City Guards. There are a lot of things that don't make a lot of sense in the Pokémon world. I know that they serve as roadblocks, but the guards at the gates of Saffron City make no sense because they won't let the player pass until they get a drink. Now that I think about it, the old man in Viridian City behaves the same, as he won't let anyone pass until he gets his coffee. Of course, in the Japanese version, the old man is drunk and he can't get up, but I think that blocking a public path because somebody's thirsty is completely out of place. Articuno through binoculars. Articuno holds a special place in my heart because it's one of my favorite legendary Pokémon, and it's also the first legendary Pokémon in the Kanto and National Dex. If you go east of Fuchsia City, there's a building with binoculars on the second floor. If you look through them, you'll see a large shining bird flying toward the sea. The anomaly here, as some of you may know, is that even if you go to the Seafoam Islands to catch the legendary Iceberg and go back to this place, you'll still see this majestic Pokémon through the binoculars. We know that there are more than one Articuno, but since we're talking about Generation 1, it's likely that this is just an oversight. Cerulean Cave overpowered Pokémon. Cerulean Cave, or the Unknown Dungeon, is the final location in the Kanto region where Mewtwo awaits, and one of the first things we notice is that the Pokémon there are overpowered. We can find Pokémon up to level 67, not even taking into account Mewtwo, who awaits at level 70. I've always thought that since Mewtwo decided to live in that cave, he's been training by defeating the Pokémon there, who in turn have grown stronger themselves. It's worth noting that if you check the map in Pokémon Red and Blue, you won't be able to locate the place. Nonetheless, if you enter the cave and open the map, your current location will show up as Cerulean Cave. I guess this was done to keep the location a secret. If you check Rhydon's locations in the Pokédex, it will say Area Unknown in spite of Rhydon actually appearing in Cerulean Cave as a wild Pokémon. Pokémon Statues. We've seen a lot of statues across Gen 1 Kanto, and they all look the same. In fact, they look like cartoony Rhydon, and at some point I thought they represented some sort of Pokémon god, but they are only a very generic depiction of the first Pokémon ever designed. However, while the same Rhydon-like statue can be found in Fire Red and Leaf Green, there's an exception in the Cinnabar Mansion, as some of the statues found there aren't Rhydon, but Mewtwo. The SSN never returns. The SSN is one of the locations I love the most, and I guess one of the main reasons is because I know that once I leave it, it will depart, never to come back again, and that gives me a greater sense of appreciation for it. Many years ago, there were rumors about the SSN coming back after the span of 1 year, and that you could board it and go to incredible places such as Neon City, a place similar to Celadon but bigger and more interesting. As I said in my Liminal Spaces Iceberg, the SSN's departure port gives off a vibe of liminality, especially because of the out-of-place truck and the fact that once the SSN is gone, it will never return again. The SSN feels like an anomaly because there's no in-game information that says what happened to it, and there are no references to it with the exception of an NPC in Ruby and Sapphire that says that the abandoned ship reminds him of the SSN. The fact that the ship sinks in the anime doesn't help, and we might never know what the final destination of that ship is. Venomoth and Butterfree swap theory. This is an old theory, but I didn't speak about it in my first Pokémon Iceberg, so I think this is the time. As you may know, Venonat and Butterfree bear some resemblance due to the color, feet, eyes and antennae, something that made people wonder if Game Freak had mixed up the Evolutionary line with another pair of Pokémon. The Pokémon in question are Metapod and Venomoth because their eyes are quite similar, even though the rest of their bodies isn't. However, it's expected that a cocoon Pokémon like Metapod evolves into a butterfly, so most probably it's just a design coincidence. Hotel. It's true that there are places in the Pokémon world that offer little to no useful information, but I think that the hotel in Celadon City, if it weren't for the infamous Ghost PC, would be entirely unremarkable. For one, the 4 NPCs inside don't have too much to say, and the building itself doesn't even include stairs to explore other floors where one might expect to find hidden items or bits of lore. The most widely accepted theory is that this location was originally intended to be Celadon's Pokémon Center. This would explain the existence of the Ghost PC, as its sprite was deleted, but the access point to it remained. Kangaskhan hatching from an egg. Kangaskhan is a unique Pokémon. There's no instance in any of the core series games where Kangaskhan is not seen with her offspring, but one of the most mysterious events happens when you hatch a Kangaskhan egg. You would expect the baby version of Kangaskhan to hatch, but instead, it's the mother with the baby that hatches from the egg. Considering that baby Pokémon became a thing in Gen 2, I think they missed the opportunity to give Kangaskhan a pre-evolution, something that hasn't happened in over 25 years. Charizard can't learn fly. The very first thing that Charmeleon did when it evolved into Charizard was to fly in order to chase Aerodactyl. The fact that Charizard wasn't able to fly in Red and Blue was completely out of place, especially when wingless Pokémon like Doduo or Dodrio could. As many of you know, this was fixed in Pokémon Yellow. You could of course trade a Charizard from Yellow to Red or Blue to have access to this Pokémon with fly. Cubon's skull. Cubone is one of the most tragic Pokémon of all time, as we see it wearing the skull of its dead mother. This is a similar case to that of Kangaskhan, since we see a Pokémon hatching from an egg with an element that is not supposed to have, in this case, Cubone's skull. It would make sense if a Cubone hatching from an egg showed up without a skull, and only the wild Cubone could have them. But again, this is an inconsistency they haven't fixed throughout the generations. Unused truck. We all know the truck where Mew is supposed to be under, but this time I'm not gonna focus on Mew, but on the truck itself. Nowhere in the entire Kanto region can we find any type of transportation other than bikes, meaning that the truck is a complete anomaly in the Kanto region of Gen 1. I was checking the cutting room floor for more information about the truck, and I found that the same one could be found in a scrap town present in the source code of Pokémon Red and Blue. It is unknown if the truck is only for decoration or if it had some specific purpose, but it's interesting that we could find this mythical vehicle in an unused town. This truck made it into the Gen 3 remakes as well as Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, but it doesn't serve any purpose other than being a reference to the first gen games and hiding a couple of items. Arcanine is a legendary Pokémon. It's worth noting that none of the actual legendary Pokémon in Gen 1 is classified as a legendary Pokémon, but that Arcanine, an ordinary Pokémon, is considered as one. This is also referenced in the second episode of the Pokémon anime, where Ash sees a depiction of the 3 legendary birds in Arcanine, as if all of them belong to the legendary category. Although this Pokémon is considered legendary in China in the first generations, they stopped referencing this Asian country from Generation 7 onward. There is actually a sprite for a beta legendary Pokémon that resembles Arcanine and that some believe to be the real trio master of the legendary beasts in Generation 2. Surfing Pikachu. Nobody would have thought about an electric mouse that can master the sea waves, but apparently Game Freak did. In Pokémon Stadium, if you have a Pikachu from Pokémon Yellow in your team and you beat the Round 2 Prime Cup on the Master Ball category, your Pikachu will be able to learn surf. This Pokémon can also be used to play a special surfing minigame south of Fuchsia City, and if you had a Game Boy printer, you could print your score with Pikachu and its surfing board on the background. This very Pikachu was the inspiration for Puka, a surfing Pikachu with extrasensory abilities, and also for Alolan Raichu that can surf on its tail. Moltres in Victory Road. Moltres in Victory Road is an anomaly. When we talk about legendary Pokémon, we think of them as these rare Pokémon that almost nobody has seen, or it's debated whether their existence is real or not. You would expect them to appear in isolated places such as Articuno in the Seafoam Islands, or Moltres at the summit of Mount Ember in Fire Red and Leaf Green. Nonetheless, Moltres in the Gen 1 games can be found in Victory Road, but the fact that there's another trainer a couple of steps away from it makes its location feel completely out of place. Considering the fact that they moved Moltres to Mount Ember in the remakes, it makes me think that in the first games there wasn't enough space for the Firebird to have its own location, and they had no choice but to stick to Victory Road. Slowpoke's evolution. Both in the anime and in the core series games, it is said that Slowpoke evolves into Slowbro once a Shelder bites its tail. In reality, Slowpoke evolves at level 37 and without the influence of Shelder or any other Pokémon in the player's party. In one of my Icebergs, I spoke about Taban, the creature we see attached to Slowbro, and that doesn't look like Shelder whatsoever. Back in the Space World 97 demo, this Pokémon existed as an independent creature, and it makes me think that when a Slowbro passes away, this Pokémon would detach from its host and survive independently, but sadly, Taban was one of the many Pokémon that didn't make the final cut. Nidoran male and Nidoran female. Pokémon was simpler back in the 90s. No double battles, no abilities, and of course no genders. Only Pokémon, with the exception of Nidoran male and Nidoran female. Most Pokémon that can be male or female don't show any important visible differences, especially in Gen 2, where the only way of knowing if a Pokémon was male or female is by the symbol next to their names. But apparently, Nidoran male and Nidoran female are treated more like different species, rather than variations of the same Pokémon. There are some oddities when it comes to breeding, as Nidorina and Nidoqueen can't lay eggs, meaning that they are treated more like separate species instead of different genders of the same Pokémon. Abandoned power plant. I've spoken about this in my Liminal Spaces Iceberg, but I think I should also speak about the mystery behind why the place was abandoned. This is probably a stretch, but it is said that the plant was abandoned due to the presence of Zapdos in the place, since as an electric Pokémon, it's probably attracted to the power plant. However, if we take a look at the place, we can see it's almost in ruins, as we can see debris in the shape of rocks both in Generation 1 and Generation 3. This means that the place has been abandoned for a long time, and yet Kanto, or at least the neighboring towns, are still powered by the plant. Maybe Zapdos' presence is what generates enough electricity to power the entire region. This doesn't account for when Zapdos is caught by the main character, so nobody knows for sure. Pokémon Water Blue and Thunder Yellow. When we heard about the release of Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green in Japan, many thought that, same as it happened with the Gen 1 games, we would get a blue instead of a green version, and that the game in question would be called Water Blue. After these games hit the shelves in America, and considering we got Pokémon Yellow, Crystal and Emerald, everybody was getting ready to play Pokémon Thunder Yellow with Pikachu as your starter Pokémon, as well as with elements from the anime. However, as we all know, this never happened. University Magikarp. The Tamamushi University Magikarp is likely one of the earliest event Pokémon besides Mew, and what made this weak Pokémon special was the fact that it knew the move Dragon Rage, a powerful dragon-type attack learned by its evolution. Considering that Pokémon at level 15 have low HP, and that Magikarp is a fast Pokémon with access to a move that does 40 HP damage, we can say that the University Magikarp is a pretty decent Pokémon. Mewtwo doesn't resemble Mew. Mewtwo is a very unique Pokémon, and not only because of its godlike power. What I mean is that it's the only clone that displays a completely different appearance from the Pokémon it was cloned from. Whenever we see cloned Pokémon, they look exactly the same, with maybe the exception of the Kanto starters that display marks on their skin. However, Mewtwo is not an exact copy of Mew, but a clone that has its own features. This was obviously done to make Mewtwo its own Pokémon instead of just a copy of the mythical Pokémon Mew. Mew. In Pokémon Adventures, Mewtwo is also created with Blaine's DNA, and this could explain why Mewtwo looks different from Mew, but the truth is that Mewtwo already looked different from Mew before getting Blaine's DNA, it only looked incomplete. Bird type. We are familiar with the flying type, but if you messed around with the missing no glitch, you might remember the bird type. This type is not a mistranslation of the flying type, it's actually its own type, and it's a physical type with index number 0x06 that is placed after rock and before bug. This type is neutrally effective against all types, and all types are neutrally effective against it. Red's dad. Dads in the Pokémon world have a tendency for being absent in many Pokémon games, and Gen 1 is definitely not an exception. Nonetheless, if you go to the Celadon department store, Red will see a sports game saying that his dad would like it. Considering we got to explore every corner of the Kanto region, it's safe to say that Red's dad is somewhere else. Box trick. I don't know if this applies for other generations, but I remember that in Generation 1, I had a Pokémon at level 100 that would increase their stats despite being at level 100 if I placed them in the PC and then took them out. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean that you can reach the highest stats possible, as your Pokémon is still limited by their individual values, but it was definitely an effective method to make your Pokémon as strong as possible in spite of being at level 100. Boy turns into Kadabra. It happened one morning. A boy with extrasensory powers awoke in bed, transformed into Kadabra. For being a serious encyclopedia, the Pokédex seems to claim that the event in question did happen, at least in Kadabra's Pokédex entry in Fire Red. Emerald is more cautious about this, as it states that the story is only a rumor, but wherever this rumor comes from, it's kind of weird because Kadabra is an evolved Pokémon, and this doesn't explain where Abra comes from. Real-world references. Back in the 90s, we could see references to the real world in both the anime and the games in the form of animals and places. In the Gen 1 games, we can see bird keepers holding a generic bird or cooks on the SSN talking about eels. Real places have been mentioned throughout the Gen 1 games, such as America, Guyana, China, the Pacific Ocean, among others. As the Pokémon franchise evolved, these references became scarce to separate the real world from the Pokémon universe. Ghost and the Sylph Scope. There are a lot of anomalies when it comes to ghost Pokémon. A ghost is supposed to be the spirit of a dead creature, like a human being or a Pokémon, for example. What happens though when two ghost Pokémon breed and the offspring is a Ghastly? It doesn't make a lot of sense that Ghastly is the spirit of another creature who died, but it doesn't end there. The Sylph Scope is a key item developed by the Sylph Company, and its purpose is to identify ghost Pokémon that otherwise appear as ghosts, an entity that you cannot battle or catch. If this is the case, how is it that other trainers have ghost Pokémon in their possession? It might be that only channelers or trainers with supernatural powers can see and catch them without the aid of the Sylph Scope, but that still doesn't explain how regular trainers in future games have ghost Pokémon unless they also have Sylph Scopes. Considering that this is early in the history of Pokémon, it's no wonder. Blaine's design. When it comes to the core series games, we are used to seeing Blaine as a bald old man with a lab coat. However, in early Sugimori artwork for Pokémon Red and Green, we can see Blaine wearing a military uniform and with a design that resembles Blaine in the Pokémon anime. The fact that he looks like a soldier makes me wonder if he had any relation with Surge, but we might never know. Blue's appearance. One of the things that I didn't pay too much attention to was Blue's appearance in Red and Blue. Look at how he looks when you battle him at the Pokémon League, and now look at how he looks in previous battles. I think he looks drastically different, and maybe it's just the clothes and haircut, but he's the only character in the entire game who has more than one battle sprite. In fact, he has 3. Faraway Island not accessible in Fire Red or Leaf Green. Mew is the quintessential mythical Pokémon, and considering I saw that there was a secret location in the Pokémon games where you could find Mew, I really thought you could access this place in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but in reality, Pokémon Emerald is the only game in the entire series where you can do that. I remember a time when I heard about these mythical islands, and I really didn't know that you needed an old map to get there. I innocently thought that the glitches present in Pokémon Red and Blue could also be performed in the remakes, but I quickly noticed that they didn't, and that they were simply programmed differently. So when I tried to pull off the Mew glitch, I was disappointed to realize I wouldn't be able to get the mythical Pokémon Mew in my Gen 3 games. The old C map saw a very limited distribution in Japan, and it was only for Japanese copies of Pokémon Emerald, so no wonder why not too many people got their hands in this versatile Pokémon. Red talks. We've always known Red for being a silent protagonist, although recently we've seen him talking in Pokémon Masters. However, in Pokémon Red and Blue, there's a single instance where we can see this character speaking, and that's in an interaction with Copycat. The Sevi Islands aren't part of Kanto. Whenever I talk about the Sevi Islands, I tend to say that these islands introduced in Fire Red and Leaf Green belong to the Kanto region. While this has been stated on official Japanese magazines, in-game information states the opposite. For example, on one island, Bill mentions that they should head back to Kanto, and Lostel's uncle says that the people from 3 Island have changed their attitude toward Kanto people. Talking about it, the Sevi Islands and the Orange Islands share some similarities, as both places are composed of islands that happen to be south of Kanto and are home to some of the legendary birds. Japanese Pokémon Blue. This is not an in-game oddity, but it sure is weird because while Pokémon Blue was sold at game stores, the Japanese version of Pokémon Blue could only be obtained by mail to people who requested it using an application included in an issue of the CoroCoro magazine. It wasn't until October 10, 1999 that Pokémon Blue was sold at stores in Japan, more than a year after Pokémon Yellow was released. Underleveled fully evolved Pokémon. Pokémon Yellow has a very nice in-game trade. If you were like me and didn't have a lot of people to trade Pokémon with when you were a child, you could get a powerful Machamp in Pokémon Yellow if you have a Cubone with you. However, there's a way you can get this fully evolved Pokémon at level 5. All you have to do is to hatch a Cubone in any Gen 2 game and trade it to Pokémon Yellow. At the entrance of the North Underground path, you can find a trainer that will trade you a Machoke that will evolve into a Machamp for your Cubone. Since Cubone is at level 5 and the Pokémon you get will always match the level of your previous Pokémon, you can get a Machamp at level 5. Psychic Pikachu. If you thought that Pikachu learning Surf wasn't common, imagine a Pikachu learning Psychic. In reality, Pikachu can't learn Psychic through normal means, but in spite of this, it has a unique animation in Pokémon Stadium if your Pikachu happens to know Psychic. As you can see, Pikachu crosses its arms in an effort to launch a Psychic move, something that is a complete anomaly, considering that this is a unique animation in Pokémon Stadium for a move that isn't even legal. Prototype names. Before the original Pokémon got their final names, there were some that retained part of their Japanese names at some point or had a completely different one before the release of Red and Blue. For example, Scyther was known as Strike, basically the same name as in Japanese. Kabuto and Kabutops were known as At and Lantis respectively, an obvious reference to the lost city of Atlantis. Eevee's prototype name was Eon, which makes a lot of sense considering that all of its evolutions have Eon at the end of their names. Lapras was known as Ness, in reference to the Loch Ness monster. The Machop line had names that reference different martial arts. Tangela was known as Medusa, and Cubone as Orphan, for example. Pokémon Yellow Cries. We know that Pokémon Yellow is based on the Pokémon anime. It tried to implement several elements like Team Rocket and Pikachu as a starter, a Pokémon that also happened to have the anime's voice instead of its usual cry. But did you know that Pikachu wasn't the only Pokémon who was gonna have a voice, but basically all of the Gen 1 monsters? Here are some of the cries that were intended for some Pokémon in Pokémon Yellow, but that due to the system's limitations, they weren't implemented. Pokémon Pink. In the leaked source for Pokémon Yellow, there are a few mentions of an unreleased Pokémon game called Pokémon Pink. This has led many to speculate that Pokémon Yellow was going to be released together with Pokémon Pink. Considering the name of the unreleased game, it's normal to think that the mascot of this game would be a pink Pokémon. Taking into account that Clefairy was planned to be Pokémon's mascot instead of Pikachu, it's likely that Clefairy would be the starter and the mascot for Pokémon Pink. There's an image of a frame in the Japanese version of the Game Boy camera where both Pikachu and Clefairy appear. Also, in Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, inside the Pokémon fan club, there's a trio of plushie dolls in the form of Pikachu, the starter of Yellow, Eevee, the Pokémon your rival chooses, and Clefairy, the potential starter of Pokémon Pink. Playground rumors. Back in the 90s, when the internet wasn't as widespread as it is today, rumors about the Pokémon games were everywhere. The most recurrent rumors were those of a special kind of Pokémon known as Pokégods. I think the first Pokégod ever is in fact a real Pokémon, because Mew was considered as one because of how rare it was. Nonetheless, there were other Pokégods inspired by real future Pokémon, such as Pikachu, a name that originated from some of Topps cards for Pokémon the first movie when referring to Meryl. Of course, there were bound to be other Pokégods that weren't real, such as Nidogod and Nidogoddess, and even some that went completely beyond the realm of what's acceptable in the Pokémon universe. Besides fictional Pokémon, there were fictional places as well. One of them was Bill's Garden, the area behind Bill's house that was deemed Pokégod's land, or at least a place where you could catch rare Pokémon. A similar instance is that of Pallet Fields, the area east and west of Pallet Town that in reality is nothing but an empty space, given that if you use a walk through walls cheat, the game will freeze. Nonetheless, it was believed to be a place where you could catch the Kanto starters, but the rumors were false, of course. The SSN wasn't safe from these rumors, and it was said that the ship would return after 1 year, or after beating the Elite Four 50 times in a row without saving the game, and that after meeting these requirements, the player would be able to board the SSN and visit Neon City, a place that is based on a big city that was featured in the episode The Song of Jigglypuff. There's a plethora of rumors like this, and some of them were so local that probably didn't end up on the internet back then. So if you experienced Pokemon in the 90s as a child, please let me know what kind of crazy rumors you heard about these games. Kanto's liminality. In my most recent Iceberg, I spoke about liminal spaces in the Pokemon world, and how Kanto turns into one as soon as you finish the Elite Four. I know that there are liminal spaces like the Power Plant or the Underground Paths, but if you completed most of what there's to finish in Red, Blue and Yellow, meaning catching all Pokemon and training your favorite creatures until they reach level 100, the game becomes really off. The post-game in this generation is basically non-existent, with the exception of Cerulean Cave and Mewtwo. If you did that and completed the Pokédex, there's not a lot to do. You come across the same NPCs saying the exact same thing as when you started your adventure, including those close to you like your mom and Professor Oak. There's this limbo that you end up in after beating the Elite Four time and again. Time has apparently stopped in a dimension you are free to explore, but one that lacks true meaning because everything you could have achieved, you've already done. Playing the first gen of Pokemon games is very nostalgic, but there's a point where the boundary between nostalgia and liminality blurs out, and even though most video games share the same fate, there's something about Kanto that hits differently. Beta Pokemon. The world of beta and unused Pokémon is fascinating because it's like taking a look into a parallel universe where Pokémon could have taken another path. In the leaked source code for Pokémon Red and Blue, there are some back sprites of unused Pokémon that apparently made it into the game at some point but were left out. Here are some of them. Gyaon, a reptilian Pokémon that probably became Tyranitar in Generation 2. Barunda, a balloon Pokémon that could have ended up becoming Jigglypuff or Drifloon. Boo, a Pokémon that bears a striking resemblance to Jinx, but that contrary to popular belief, coexisted with her. I guess that due to how similar they were, they chose to keep Jinx in the Pokédex. Dia, a moose-like Pokémon that could have been the inspiration for Stantler. An elephant Pokémon bearing a stronger resemblance to Copperasha than to Donphan. Kuroki, a crocodile Pokémon. Two Pokémon that resemble squids, probably reworked into Tentacool and Tentacruel. Kakutasu, a creature that probably inspired Cagnia or Maractus's design. Giagu, a shark that may have been reworked into Sharpedo. Two fish Pokémon, one of which resembles a cheap chip from the Super Mario Bros. Franchise. A Vulpix pre-evolution that was planned to be included in Generation 2 under the name Mikon, but that never saw the light of day. Two Pokémon that apparently are related, although I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. Three lizard Pokémon that were next to the Sandshrew line and that also bear some resemblance to the Kurusu line from the Space World 97 demo. A middle evolution between Psyduck and Golduck. Konya, a pre-evolution of Meowth, the pre-evolution of Magneton, very similar but without some magnets, a cut evolution of Marowak that resembles Kangaskhan since it's also carrying a baby, Giopin, a pre-evolution of Goldeen, three tiger-like Pokémon, two of which were planned to make a return in Gold and Silver, a pre-evolution of Ponyta, a pre-evolution of Blastoise, what appears to be Gorochu, Raichu's evolution, and the original evolution for Wartortle, and that was replaced with the Blastoise we are familiar with. Thank you so much for watching. We're almost at 20,000 subscribers, so if you've enjoyed the content, please consider joining this amazing community. I want to thank Gonzalo Reyes for becoming a member of the channel. Don't forget to join the members of the channel if you want to support me even further and learn how to become a PokeTuber. Also, subscribe to the Eisenberg Experience, where I talk about video game icebergs. See you in the next one.